You're listening to the Millionacres Podcast. Our mission at Millionacres is to educate and empower investors to make great decisions and achieve real estate investing success. We provide regular content and perspective for everyone, from those just starting out to seasoned pros with decades of experience. At Millionacres, we work every day to help you demystify real estate investing and build real wealth.
Hello, I'm Deidre Woolard, an editor at Millionacres, and thank you so much for tuning into the Millionacres Podcast. One of the biggest blockers that people have about owning rental property is that they're nervous about being a landlord. It's understandable, especially after watching all the eviction moratoriums this year, seeing so many landlords in trouble. And I believe that so much of a great landlord-tenant relationship all comes down to good screening. That's what we're going to dive into today. So my guest is Steve White, the founder and CEO of Rent Prep, a tenant screening solution for busy landlords. He has over 20 years of experience in the credit industry and in entrepreneurship. He leads a growing team of executives determined to make renting easier for all of us, which I think we all want. So welcome.
Thanks. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
So we're talking now at a time when we're seeing some of these eviction moratoriums expire. Some are still in place. Some are getting extended. It's kind of a mess out there right now. What are you hearing from landlords about evictions and about tenant-landlord relations in general?
Pure frustration, I would say, as everybody. And really the frustration, I think, is twofold. It's one part, just not really sure what's going on and when things are going to happen. And, a lot of that they can't control. And then, the other frustration is if you're dealing with a bad situation, there's not a whole lot that you can do about it. And I know a lot of landlords are getting the feeling as though people are being opportunistic. Certain tenants are being opportunistic and causing a lot of, headaches. It's not an easy thing to deal with in general, and everybody's kind of suffering through COVID and post-COVID, but, this has not been easy for landlords at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like landlords sometimes get cast as the villain, which I always hate. I know that so many landlords are doing everything they can to make things easier for their tenants and trying to work out a compromise.
Yeah, it's funny. We started a community, which is a really large private community now. It's a private Facebook community, but the intentions of us starting that community was to really sort of change the people's perceptions of landlords, right? For exactly what you mentioned is that they don't always have the best reputation. They don't always have, people don't always look at them in a really good light. And unfortunately, a lot of, there's enough bad apples out there that ruin the bunch. And certainly enough landlords create their own problems. But there's so many that are really trying to do the right thing. And it's an increasingly more difficult job to stay on top of what's changing, laws, local laws, federal laws. And it's becoming, more and more difficult to really walk a straight path as a landlord.
Well, and I think technology is both hurts and helps in that area to some extent. So let's talk a little bit about tenant screening. I've had a conversation with other guests on the show about credit scores, how much you should consider them, how little you should consider them. Where do you fall on that?
Well, it's funny. The data that we have over the years consistently shows that it's always split down the middle 50-50 with landlords. Half of our products that we sell include, credit reports or credit scores, and the other half does not. And so I think it really comes down to the property and the landlord's preferences. We deal with a lot of landlords that have the mindset that, they expect the renter to not have great credit. If they did, they'd likely own a home. And so that's sort of the mindset. We've got a lot of landlords that deal with affordable housing or Section 8 housing. And, credit's sort of irrelevant there as well. So there's enough cases where I think, it's logical that credit wouldn't be, something that really makes a huge impact. But there's plenty of cases where it does. So I really think it comes down to the property more than anything.
Interesting, because that ties in with a question I have about the sort of the hard facts of tenant screening and the sort of like intuitive soft stuff. So you have data, you've got your credit score, job history, all of the things that you can check. And then you also have these, the softer stuff, the impressions you get from the tenant interview or from the reference calls. As a landlord, how do you kind of weigh those factors?
I have a formula for that.
Excellent.
So it's interesting. The right formula, I believe, is 2 parts data, 1 part gut feeling. Um, you know, you don't want to discount that gut feeling that you have, and especially if you've been a landlord for a while, or you know people pretty well, or you think you could read people pretty well. There's been, and me personally, I've been in that situation with my own rentals where, well, first off, I own a tenant screening company, so I better be very sure that I don't pick my tenants wrong, right? That's a bad look for me. So
Yeah,
I
true.
am super careful, and there's a piece that you have to trust your gut. You have to go with what you know, and or some of maybe the subtle cues that you may pick up on from somebody, whether it be a pre-screening interview, a walkthrough. So you don't want to discount that. Definitely give that a place. You know, where your decision is made as well. But you want data to back it up also. And so I think the right formula is 2 parts data, 1 part gut feeling. Use the data as a good conversation starter. I always say background checks make the best conversation starters. If something comes up on there that's concerning or worth an additional conversation, uh, be upfront and ask them directly. Hey, can you tell me about this eviction that you had a few years ago, or this criminal record that's showing up? So usually that'll help keep a good conversation moving, and sometimes flesh some things out so that you can trust your gut a little bit more.
Interesting. I feel like that seems like a good formula. So you're a landlord yourself?
Yeah, yep. It took me. I was in the industry for about 10 years before I owned my first rental property. So I it was honestly, like, I was too busy running the business side of things, but there's always been that sort of nagging concern in the back of my mind too, of like, I got to do this right. I got to do this right. And at the time, we were using it for a lot of material on our podcast, and I learned a lot of really valuable lessons along the way, trying to be sure that I was selecting the right tenants, because it really, I mean, I know it matters for every landlord, but I felt like for me it really mattered. I could not screw this up. I had to get it right, and so going through that personally was an interesting experience for sure. But yeah, I I resisted it for a while.
So let's talk a little bit about advertising a property because that's an important part of the screening process too. What do landlords need to keep in mind?
Well, keep in mind, you want to make sure that you're not discriminating against anybody in your listing ads, right? I see this a lot of times, and some landlords have that mentality of it's my property. I can choose who I want, and to some extent that might be true, but there's a lot of discrimination laws out there that would say otherwise in certain cases. So you want to be careful what you write in your listings. But it's a sales effort at the end of the day, so you want to make sure that you're being honest, but you're you're painting it in a way that's going to attract interest, and you got to find that delicate balance. That's why the old joke used to be that if a house was charming, you knew that it was a tiny, tiny house, and there was little keywords that you can pick up on, and I think that's sort of where that balance lies with landlords too. You want to be honest. You don't want to paint it out to be something that when they go through and do a walkthrough, they're like, this was not at all what you described. And I believe that there's, especially nowadays, places don't sit vacant very long. If you're honest, you're gonna find the right person for it eventually.
Absolutely. So I want to ask you this question about advertising, which is, do you think it makes sense to advertise kind of everywhere cast the biggest net? Or do you feel like it makes more sense to sort of be a little more selective and kind of narrow down your tenant pool to start off with? What's your take on that?
That's a good question because I know there's a lot of services out there now that syndicate your listing. You put it in one place and it blasts it out there. And I've seen situations where it's helpful. And obviously you want to choose from a good pool of candidates. You certainly want to choose the best out of a number of candidates and not choose the least worst out of two or three. So, you want to make sure you're getting a good selection pool. But I've also seen kind of it swing a little bit too far, also where landlords are being inundated by too many, and they're not qualified, or they're just sort of getting blasted out in these responses. So I think that a lot of times it comes down to where you are, what area you're in. If you're in an urban area, a lot of times people are conditioned to look on platforms like Zillow or apartments.com. If you're in, more of the suburbs or more in a rural area, good old fashioned Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, putting a sign out in the front lawn. Those things are tried and true and still work very effectively.
I feel like there hasn't ever become a single solution for rentals the same way that there has been with like a Zillow. There isn't really a Zillow for rentals. I mean, Zillow is obviously getting into rentals. You've got apartments.com, CoStar, you've got, Redfin just bought RentPath. So you've got a bunch of different players, but there's not really a default solution. Is that something that you sort of have seen in the industry as well?
Yeah, I would say over the past couple of years, we've definitely seen this move towards consolidation, where a lot of the big players are buying up, the smaller ones, or even some that are just local. So, I don't know if there's ever going to be, and I don't know if we ever really want just a single source either. I think again, I think it comes down to where you're at, where the location of the property is. I think those things are still, at least right now, they weigh pretty heavily in terms of where you're going to find the most success in listing your property. So, and eventually, keep in mind, all of these free platforms that are out there, their end game, their end goal is always to monetize, always to make money somehow. So you're gonna get stuff for free. We see it with competitors in our tenant screening space as well. It's free until it's not, and nothing is free forever. So at some point, it's gonna cost you. So you want to keep that in the back of your mind too, before you commit to something long term or get really used to something that seems to be working and it's great because it's free. It probably won't be for very long.
That is a good point, because parts of Zillow's rental manager were free and now not as much. So that certainly made people not too happy because they had gotten used to it. And that's definitely something to keep in mind. And so speaking about competition a little bit, I want to ask you, institutional landlords right now, we're seeing these massive portfolios. You've got Invitation Homes, you've got a whole bunch of other companies that are starting to buy these big rental portfolios, 80,000 single family residences. How do individual landlords compete with that? And what does sort of that kind of process and that trend meaning for your space?
It's tough because, especially where we are in New York, we feel like, from what we're seeing, legislation is sort of supporting that institutional side, and disadvantaging the smaller independent landlords. So it doesn't seem to be just a financial trend. It seems to be backed by by a lot of people, and a lot of people with influence. So that's definitely concerning. I also feel like it's I'm hoping that this is sort of a bubble that we're still in. We're all in my industry, we're all sort of expecting it to pop at some point. It hasn't yet, but I just don't think that I don't think that it's sustainable. I don't think this is going to be something that a year from now or 2 years from now, you're going to see this trend continuing. I think right now, it's, it's popular. It's a thing. We know that even corporate America has been buying up a lot of single family homes and rentals because it's cheaper for them to manage the rental than it is to send their executives for, longer stays at hotels and things like that. So I think it's just sort of a um, shift in the marketplace. I don't think that landlords are going to be squeezed out completely. I think it's going to be competitive for a while, more so than what they were used to. Um, but I don't think that's gonna sustain itself for any long-term period. So I think for landlords, really, as always, if you're an investor, um, you know, it's important to put your energy into the purchase, and that's going to be tough right now. And so I see a lot of investors getting creative, uh, going to talk to people before the house goes on the market, and trying to sort of, find, back doors into deals versus competing with everybody in the market right now.
What are you thinking about this single family rental boom in general? A lot of institutional money is being thrown at it, which makes me think that they're really seeing it as a long-term trend versus a short-term, everybody needs to live separately because of COVID kind of trend. What's your take on it?
I definitely think a little bit of that too, which again, I think is going to be a trend. I know on the business side of things, I'm already starting to see. A year ago, if you'd have asked me, this is a really good example. A year ago, if you'd have asked me, what do I think about remote working? I would have said, it's fantastic. We never considered it. We were forced into it. It worked. That's a legit scaling strategy. And unfortunately, we had just purchased a brand new office and we're building out a brand new office, which was, yeah, terrible timing. And then I started thinking, well, if we start making everybody go remote, what's the point of even having this big office and all these desks to have screeners sit in here? But I think what time is sort of is proving is there are tax implications that people didn't think of from the work from home. Uh, there's the cultural implications of work from home. And I think you're going to see again sort of the pendulum swing again. And the area that I'm in, there was a big concern about commercial property. We had huge banks and companies back out of commercial deals because they were thinking we're never going to need this space. Everyone's going to work from home. And I think that was sort of the trend too on the single family homes as well, thinking, there's going to be this big shift. People are not going to want to be in these big multifamilies where you're dealing with loud neighbors upstairs, downstairs, and sort of rebuilt the vision of what working class, middle class looks like. And they were in single family homes working from home. But again, I think that's going to shift back. And I think eventually things will kind of go back to a little bit of what it used to look like pre-pandemic. But I think that was driving a lot of it too on the institutional side to start looking at single family homes instead of multifamily. We had a screener who had issues with a dog upstairs that she was living in a multifamily. I think it was maybe a 8 or a 12 plex. And she had a dog upstairs that would chew on a bone and rattle the whole house when the dog was chewing on this bone. And, it was a real issue for her, especially working from home. And so she started looking into the single family market. And I think that, again, that was sort of a trend at the time. May continue for a bit, but I do expect to see it swing back.
I feel like that's an unpopular view a little bit, but I feel like I share it as well. I've been talking to a lot of people about offices, and there's so much talk about hybrid. I feel like mostly hybrid's untested, and I think 3 or 4 years we might be pretty close back to where we were, but with more flexibility.
We had our screening staff was pretty much kicking the door in, trying to get back into the office, saying we're done. We don't want to work from home anymore. But I think too that, again, these large companies are starting to see the cultural impact. I know recently there's been a lot of talk about the tax implications that a lot of companies did not consider, that when people start moving away, it no longer matters where your office is. Now it matters where they are and how payroll taxes are going to affect them if they're in a different state or sometimes different counties. So I think um, there was a lot of booby traps that people didn't see that were laid out, and we're sort of stepping in them now. And so I think that eventually there'll be this sort of pushback to let's get back to what normal looks like for those of us who can remember what pre-pandemic felt and looked like.
Right. So you mentioned you've got screeners. So those screeners are then are they kind of making those calls so that the landlords themselves don't have to make all of those calls? I feel like as we all get older, we're like, oh, phone calls.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, exactly, right. So I see this with my son. I see this with my niece, my nephew. There's this phonophobia that people had, to even call and order a pizza or something. So we saw that as an opportunity years ago, and we're making verification phone calls to other landlords or employers, and we just sort of stuck with that business structure and ended up being, I think, really what separates us from the rest of our competitors or the rest of the screening that's out there is that we are not a tech company. We have developers, and we're sort of forced into the tech space, whether we like it or not now. But as we started, I had no intentions of doing a tech company. We were a service-based business, and we still operate that way. It's a rarity now. We will get somebody that calls in, a landlord will call in, and they're startled when someone answers the phone. And they're like, "Are you a real person? Is this a real human being that I'm talking to?" So we sort of went against the grain when a lot of people were putting investing huge into automation and technology platforms. Um, I I always had the sense that landlords especially needed as much personal service as possible, to just be able to call up and say, what does this mean? I don't look at a lot of credit reports. This looks weird. Can you help me understand this? Or, this is a weird criminal record that I don't know what it means. It's from a different state. Uh, and there is no, at least that I've seen, there's no good AI out there that's going to do that. You have to have a well-trained screener who does this day in and day out, that can kind of hold their hands and say, this is what it means, or this is what we see. And so we've built the business and grown it on that concept, which again wasn't always popular. I've been told many times, you need to invest in the automation side of things, and we just said, I don't know if that's where the industry is going to be going at some point, at least for private landlords that want that service.
Yeah, I think that we've all seen kind of the limits of chatbots and things like that in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about rental laws that you're seeing. It seems like there's a bunch of different laws coming out. Some of them, I think, kind of got paused a little bit. With COVID, we all started focusing on evictions. But there was a law that came out in Seattle about which tenants should have priority, and that you have to you had to accept the first qualified tenant. Do you think we're going to see more laws like that? Is there anything that you're noticing, around the country that we should be aware of?
Yeah, our fear is always that those type of laws, they set a precedent, and then other places tend to often lazily pick them up because it's done, it's written. They don't need to think through anything. They're letting this other municipality or state or wherever it is sort of prove its concept, and so they don't need to reinvent the wheel. We saw it in Cook County that had a rule that you had to run the background check minus criminal records, make a rental decision, then you can run criminal records as a way to make sure that people weren't being discriminated against because of their criminal history. Cook County was the first place to do it, and now we see that Maryland has adopted that as well. There are pockets and places, municipalities around the country that are that are doing what Seattle's doing on their first come, first serve. So that to me is always the concern. When you see it, you know that that's not going to be the only place that you end up seeing it in. It's going to pop up somewhere else. And it, I think it's concerning enough. It's concerning enough because I think that it takes away some of the landlords' ability to choose the best fit or the right fit for their properties. So even if you're doing everything right, and like we talked about earlier with trusting your gut, you could be put into a situation where you don't have that luxury to be able to trust your gut, because now you've got a law that compels you to base your decision on what they're telling you versus what you know.
So do you feel that landlords should take a role in local politics, or at least be aware of what's happening? How can people kind of make sure that they know, A, what the laws are, and B, what laws are coming up?
It's a great question. We're in the industry, and sometimes we don't feel like we know. It's especially now, it happens so fast. About 2 years ago, coming up on 2 years, New York changed its rules that you can no longer use evictions in the rental decisions, which is a huge deal for us as a screening company that provides eviction records. And normally when something like that comes out, there's a ton of lead time. Months in advance that this is a thing, it's being talked about, it's a bill that's going to pass. And for the first time, it literally passed on a Friday late afternoon, and it went under the radar for a lot of people and sort of became this buzz by Monday. But there wasn't a lot of lead into it. There wasn't a lot of like, we know this is coming, or this is even a consideration. We were all sort of shocked by it. And that seems to be a growing trend that we're seeing now. Virginia just did it with, theirs was COVID related. So of course they're going to move a little quicker on that kind of stuff. But it just sort of seems to be the trend to not talk about it a lot and push stuff through. And landlords should absolutely be concerned about that. So the best way for any landlord to kind of stay up to date, I always recommend joining a local landlord association or real estate investor association. The national ones are great, but the local ones where you own properties, because they're going to know about all this stuff. And usually they're tied in somehow with, whether it be politicians or the courts, to be able to spread that knowledge and spread that word. But it's happening on the municipal level so much more frequently now that even staying up to date on state laws is not good enough. And so really it's coming down to what neighborhoods your properties are in. Those are the neighborhoods you need to be paying attention to.
Awesome. That is really solid advice. Let's take a quick break here.
Like what you're hearing? Get more real estate investing news and advice from Millionacres on Instagram at Millionacres and on Twitter at Millionacres_co.
During our break today, we are excited to have Millionacres lead investment analyst Matt Argersinger here to speak briefly about one of our newest services, Real Estate Winners. Thank you for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
So what is Real Estate Winners and who is it for?
Well, I like to think of Real Estate Winners as our answer to Stock Advisor in the real estate market. It is a service that provides recommendations on publicly traded REIT real estate investment trusts and real estate companies. So it's a pretty big universe out there. There's over 200 REITs to choose from, and probably dozens, if not hundreds, of real estate companies are in our universe. And we provide regular investment recommendations as well as commentary on the market, educational material, and it's really designed to get anyone who's interested in investing and learning about real estate started.
So is it geared toward new investors, or is it more for seasoned pros?
I think Real Estate Winners can serve both. I think if you're a new investor, maybe you're just getting started with stocks and you want to learn more about how to add real estate to your portfolio, great place to start. If you're a seasoned investor and just thinking, okay, how can I diversify my portfolio, maybe reduce the volatility in my portfolio, maybe add some income to my portfolio, then I think Real Estate Winners is a great solution for that cohort as well.
Fantastic. What are the benefits of being a member of Real Estate Winners?
Number one benefit is day one when you join, you get our top 10 investment ideas at the moment. So really, right from the beginning, you know what our 10 best ideas in the publicly traded real estate market are. And then going forward on a monthly basis, you'll get a new recommendation, sometimes more than one new recommendation, as well as regular content that we're coming out. We're covering our past recommendations, providing updates, and talking about the real estate market. So it's really the full package.
Perfect. So what do you need to get started?
Really, all you need is a discount brokerage account. So if you're used to buying stocks, and you probably already have that. If you haven't bought stocks in the past, of course, just open a discount brokerage account. These days, you don't even have to pay commissions. It's fantastic. So it really couldn't be easier to get started investing with real estate winners.
Sounds fantastic. So how can people sign up?
Sure, they can head over to real.fool.com. That's real.fool.com.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. I'm back with Steve White of Red Prep, and we are talking all things tenant relations. Let's switch it up just a little bit and talk about what happens after the tenant moves in, because I feel like landlords sometimes, you get the tenant, but then I feel like so much of the process, you have to really sort of set expectations, start things off on the right foot. What are you advising landlords about that part of the process?
That's a great question, because I think that you're right? Like, so much effort and energy goes into tenant placement, finding the right tenant, getting them in, and then it's kind of like, oh, we're done. And that's where a lot of mistakes end up, happening. And a lot of times, you start off on the wrong foot, and the rest of the tenancy is going to kind of go that route. So I would say for landlords, have really good communication the first 90 days. Follow up with them, a few weeks after you move them in. How's everything going? Ask them if they need anything. Is there anything that, any light bulbs that blew out or anything crazy I need to know about? Just good old fashioned communication. How are you? How's everything going? And what I always recommend is get into the rental property at least once a year to do a visual inspection of the rental property. So, if you're, whatever the reasoning is, hey, we come in once a year, we're going to change out the air filters. We're going to make sure everything's in good working order. You have a checklist, you kind of go down that list of things that you're looking at, but that sets the right tone that tenants know they're not going to be in that property for 5 years, and no one will ever step foot in there. And so they're going to let it fall apart or do whatever they do. I think that it holds them accountable, and it lets them know that you're not an absentee landlord. You're going to check in. You're going to see how things are going, and even if it's just an email or a text or a phone call. But that communication, I feel like, is critical.
Yeah, and I think that inspection thing is actually important, because I have heard some horror stories. I'm sure you've heard some horror stories of what, a bad tenant can do some damage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we about half of our new clients, so landlords that have never used us before, about half of them come to us with a story of, this horrible thing just happened, and I never want to ever have this happen again, and I'm going to do tenant screening now. And the adoption rate for tenant screening over the past couple of years has been almost shocking. I grew up in a family where my dad owned rental properties, and even after I had this business for years, my dad still didn't screen tenants. He was old school, and it would drive me insane. And I think now it's sort of starting to shift a little, and things are changing a bit.
How did your dad get tenants then? He didn't do any screening at all?
Sign out in the front, guy looks good, has a firm handshake. It's a deal to me. And the last problem tenant that he had was a gentleman who gave him false documents saying that he was a disabled veteran, and he was not. And he said he was collecting money from the government, which he was not. And so my dad ended up having to evict this guy. And after I looked at the whole situation and looked at the documentation, everything that my dad had, I said, this is why you do tenant screening, Dad. Your son owns a tenant screening company. Let me help you. But there's a lot of old school landlords out there that, they want to look you in the eye, shake your hand. And unfortunately, that's not a two-way street anymore.
Well, and I think also this is a little bit of that penny wise, pound foolish kind of thing. You see it to some extent when people are buying property. They think, "Oh, I'm going to skip the home inspection." It's like, are you nuts? that small expense could save you so much money down the road. And I think tenant screening is like that too. A small expense can really save you having to go through an eviction process, which is always so long and expensive, and not what you want to have to deal with.
No, you are 100% right. And if you think about it in just real estate terms, right, you would never buy a house and occupy a house that you're purchasing with such little friction. Like there's, the underwriting process, and they're going to make sure that you're qualified. And so, same thing goes for rentals. If you're a landlord, you're about to hand someone the keys to arguably the most valuable asset that they probably have in their lives. So these, they don't own a house. They probably have a car. Other than that home that they're renting from you, that car is their most valuable asset. You want to make sure that it's somebody that you can trust, and they know how to take care of it. They at least know to take care of it. And so, yeah, that we say it all the time here, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you can save yourself on the front end, spend a little time doing the screening. Don't be afraid to let a place sit vacant for the sake of getting the right tenant in, and paying an extra month of vacancy is still going to be cheaper than an eviction.
True. What's your take on leases? Do you feel like you need to have a lawyer draw up a lease for you specifically? A lot of landlords are using ones that they download online. What's your take on that? Is that another place where you can really get yourself in trouble if you kind of try to save money?
Yeah, well, you save money, and it's great until you wish that you didn't try to save money. And then, when you have a judge go through and tell you that the lease is, worthless, or you run into a situation and you're like, "Oh, I never thought of that, and I probably should have put that in my lease." I don't think landlords spend enough time considering what should go into the lease. And a lot of times you're right, like they pull templates off of the internet, which to some degree is fine, but you want to customize it to the property, and you want to make sure that you're really thinking it through. You're really thinking of all things, occupants. What's, how long can you have a guest until they're considered an occupant, and not just an overnight guest, and little things like that that a lot of landlords just sort of don't consider or leave out, and it's not a problem until it's a problem, and then often it's too late.
What do you think are some early signs that you might have a difficult tenant on your hands?
The most, my opinion remains the same. It's not every single situation, but for me, one of the biggest red flags, which is right in that early beginning stage, always ask them about their previous rentals, previous landlords. If they're really quick to tell you what a horrible landlord they had, and none of their problems were addressed, and this and that, that's usually the first red flag for me. Is there's a very us versus them mentality. They're usually going to carry those issues, that problem, that mentality into the relationship with the new landlord as well. So right from the beginning, that's probably my first question. Tell me about where you're renting right now. Why do you want to leave? What happened? How'd the landlord take care of the place? How was your relationship? Did he communicate with you? And then beyond that, I would say, again, good communication is either going to solve a lot of issues, or it's going to create a lot of issues for the problem tenants. They don't want you coming in and inspecting the place. They don't want you following up and how's things going. They just want to be left alone. And, sometimes that might be okay, but I would say more often than not, a good tenant has no problem saying, "Yeah, come on in, do your inspection, check things out," or, "Hey, I appreciate the follow-up. Everything's good. So, good tenants are looking for good landlords and screening landlords just as much as landlords are screening them. So a good tenant is, you should be able to spot them. They're concerned. They want to make sure that they're going to be in a good place, but they also understand that there's rules of the game, and they've got to follow along with them just as much as the landlord needs to follow along.
I like that idea of balance. I think that's really important. What's your advice for landlords if a tenant wants to break a lease?
My advice for landlords is sometimes principal can get very expensive. Think of the situation thoroughly before you just come up to an answer and say no because of a principle-based reason. Like, well, you sign this and it's till September and it's only June, and so you're sticking it out, you're staying. Consider the whole thing. It's not worth it for you to put up a fuss if they're going to flush their socks down the toilet and kick holes in the wall because they're upset with you. It might be easier for you to help them move out. It might be easy. They might be way more willing to be helpful in, showing the place or even cleaning the place if they know that you're willing to work with them. So there's not really a one size fits all answer other than don't hold too tightly onto those principles that may not serve you well from a business perspective. And it's the same advice I give landlords when we talk about cash for keys on if you have a problem tenant and you want them out and you know that the only other remedy is probably going to be eviction, pay them to leave. Pay them to leave and say, if you clean the place and there's no damage done, you'll get $500 when you turn the keys in. I won't charge you the rest of the rent or the rest of the lease. And a lot of landlords hate this idea because it's on principle. They can't imagine a world where they're going to pay somebody when that person rightfully owes them. But from a business perspective, for me, it's, how can I spend the littlest amount of energy and friction as possible? And, what makes the most business sense? So, if it's the tenant that's looking to break the lease, maybe it makes sense. Maybe in that situation, there's 2 months left and they're going to be really accommodating and help you get the new person in. It's worth working with them. That's always my opinion.
Well, and that's good advice too about that your principles can cost you money, and I understand that it's not fair when you have to lose out on the rent as a landlord, and you have to then you have to find a new tenant or something like that. But it's also, sometimes you just have to cut your losses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the other side of it. If you've got a great tenant, how do you keep that tenant long term?
It's a great question. I don't get asked that very often. Because we're always looking at the dark side of things, right? Like, and expecting the worst. But
Right?
so I've got a great tenant in a property right now that they're awesome. They really are. Pay their rent on time. Never missed a payment through the pandemic. Anytime that there's an issue, they're great with communicating, and they're the type of tenant that you're willing to do anything to keep because the cost of what a not great tenant it looks like, or what the world could be like if you didn't have that concern and worry. And so to me, there's that peace of mind. There's a ton of value there, ton. So I go out of my way. I go out of my way to make sure that they're happy and that I serve them well when they need it. So we just had a dishwasher and a washing machine actually break within the past couple of months in that rental property. And I made sure that they were not waiting long. And I was communicating and saying, listen, I'm sorry, I'm going to get this fixed for you as soon as possible. Had somebody out for the dishwasher. That was the more recent one. I think maybe within 2 days. And that was as quick as I could move. And then we had some issues with even finding a dishwasher because of everything being in short supply with COVID and everything. And so I just go out of my way to try to make sure that I'm taking care of them. And they know that. And I think they get a sense of that too. asking them, kind of like survey questions. I think I learned that here in the business. We ask our clients all the time, what can we do to make our service better? And so the same thing for tenants. What are some things that would make your stay here better? And you know, often it's usually pretty inexpensive things. Like I've had tenants who said they didn't like the lighting. That's an easy fix. We could change the bulbs out. It was like too bright or something. Okay, I'll change the bulbs for you. One tenant requested USB ports in the plugs. Okay, $5 USB ports in the plugs. We'll have those installed. You're good. Um, so there's a balance. You don't want to, jump every time they say jump, but you want to make sure that they understand you appreciate the relationship, and you're willing to try to serve them well, and to go to bat for them when it comes time to.
Excellent. So in the last year, have you seen more tenants requesting automated payment services, other types of technology? Is that sort of something, even before COVID-19 that you were seeing?
Yeah. So right before COVID-19, I'm going to see if I remember these numbers off the top of my head, and if I don't remember exactly, I know I'm in the right ballpark. We just updated our surveys, and the adoption rate for online rental payments before the pandemic was creeping up around 50%. So a lot of landlords were still going out and picking up checks or taking cash, or that sort of thing, letting them drop it off. Through the pandemic, we saw that, basically force the adoption curve on using technology, and now it's in the probably mid 70s, 75%, something around there. So it's becoming way more accepted, to be able to collect the rent online, whether it be through a platform that you're doing it, or I know a lot of landlords that still use PayPal and Venmo and those sort of routes as well.
Interesting. So we talked at the beginning of this podcast about eviction moratoriums. There's also the cancel rent movement. There's a lot of predictions that we're going to see a wave of evictions. How concerned are you about that? And what are you thinking about what's happening right now?
I don't think there's going to be as big of a wave as people are predicting that there's going to be. I think that, not to say that there aren't landlords who are dealing with this, or there's not tenants that are dealing with it, but I know that from what we've seen, the numbers have not been as bad as anyone had predicted that they would be. So I would say the majority of our clients are 80% plus on their collection rates. So they're not dealing with huge swaths of unpaying tenants. I don't think it's going to be as bad as everyone predicts. I think that what you're going to see is probably, the courts dealing with backlogs, which is an issue. So you're going to see stuff that maybe was a pending eviction or a potential eviction before the pandemic, and now the landlords are just absolutely fed up and want those tenants out as soon as possible. So I think that you're going to probably see a stretch of time where it's cleaning things up from right before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and then I think it's going to sort of level itself out, and hopefully go back to something that resembles normalcy. But I don't think it's going to be, anything like some of the predictions that I've heard, that there's going to be this huge, wave of evictions, and as if landlords are, trying to punish people. If they were collecting rent during the pandemic and they don't have a reason to evict somebody, I don't think that they're going to have an interest to do it just because they can.
All right, last question for you. What's next for Rent Prep, and what is your kind of 5-year vision?
So in our industry, we're seeing, like we talked about a little earlier, changing legislation faster than I've ever seen it in the 20 years I've been around doing this. So we see that as a unique opportunity for Rent Prep to continue to differentiate ourselves from the industry and continue to get away from that automation and provide solutions for landlords that are based on where that landlord is. So a landlord who's, in Cook County, Illinois, does not need a one-size-fits-all tenant screening product. They need something for Cook County, Illinois, and that's really been our focus, is to focus on states, municipalities, being able to provide accurate data that is becoming harder and harder to access with states like North Carolina, that moved to a central repository for all of their criminal records. So if you're looking at national databases, North Carolina is just not going to be on there. And I think that the future is going to continue to move in that direction, just like certain ordinances like in Seattle with the order that you have to pick your tenants. That's going to be a continuing trend. And so for RentPrep, that's our focus, is to continue to build those solutions that are specific to protect the landlords.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Steve. A reminder to listeners, you can learn more at rentprep.com. You can always email us about the show at media@millionacres.com to share your thoughts. Stay well and stay invested.
Thank you for tuning in to the Millionacres Podcast. I hope you liked today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing through your favorite podcast provider. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop us a line at help@millionacres.com. Stay well and stay invested. People on this program may have an interest in the deals, offerings, or services they discussed at Million Acres, or the Motley Fool may have a formal recommendation for or against. Always consult a certified tax professional before acting on tax advice, and do not buy or sell assets based solely on what you hear.